Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night. Pick your own adventure depending on when you're watching this video. Very happy to introduce myself. My name is Stefanie Demetriades. I'm an assistant professor of communication at the College of Communication, DePaul University. And today I'm very happy to share a bit about this experimental assignment that I developed for a course that I teach here at DePaul. I've named it aptly, I hope, I Think, Therefore AI, and this experimental assignment writing about AI with AI. Now, so a bit of context about this particular assignment. One of the courses that I teach here at DePaul at the College of Communication is an introductory course to communication technology in society. And broadly speaking, that course is designed to encourage students to explore how the current technologies and the emerging technologies of the day are reshaping our kind of world and our daily experiences. And the critical piece there is to consider not only how they are shaping these experiences, but also how we can actively engage with those technologies in a critical and purposeful way. So, how do we make active choices about the technology we use? So, you can imagine with the advent of generative AI, this was both a challenge, sending many educators into a panic, and also an opportunity, particularly in a class like this, to think about how do we move past the initial panic stage and move into a critical and purposeful perspective on technologies like this. So, the task that I set to my students was to write an original op ed arguing for a clear position on the role of AI in higher education. So, an op ed, an opinion piece, is by its nature a persuasive piece. It's a very personal tone and style, something that is supposed to reflect not just a quote unquote objective perspective, but someone's deeply felt and persuasive position on an argument. So, already putting them in a position of having to make clear choices and arguments in favor of their position. That was the task. The twist was that they were required to use ChatGPT in the process of writing that op ed. So, why do an assignment like this? What's the purpose? Well, the first thing I was aiming for was to help students build critical AI literacy through actively engaging with AI, not just reading about or talking about AI in the abstract, but getting their hands into the mechanics and understanding and experiencing the process of how it works. I also wanted to encourage student ownership of the work, to emphasize that students are ultimately responsible for the final product, even if AI plays a role, that you can't simply shrug off responsibility and ultimate accountability to these technologies when it's your work and your experience on the line. To guide students to make thoughtful and informed decisions about if, why, when, and how to use AI in their work. So, here, especially trying to push through that common sort of initial instinct of being all in or all out on a new technology, and AI in particular, and thinking instead about a very systematic evaluation of where and how it can be valuable and supportive to your own work. So this was a two-part assignment that I set for the students. The first part was a process and reflection document that guided students through preparing the prompt, reflecting on the outputs, and going through an iterative process of edits with the AI. And the second was a completed kind of clean copy of the final op-ed that they produced. Each portion of this assignment was worth 50% of the grades. So there's some real weight and ownership attached to both the process and the finished product. Supporting materials were provided to the students, including the assignment overview with instructions. There were op ed guides and resources, which gave guidance on things like tone, structure, and persuasive techniques that are effective in op ed writing. There's a step by step process guide that walked them through preparing and delivering a prompt to ChatGPT, receiving that prompt, assessing it, and so on. They had a grading rubric that they used to consider not only their own process but also the finished op-ed. So the guided step-by-step process, very briefly, walked them through beginning with a very clear position statement. Clearly define your stance on AI in higher education, preparing a prompt based on that position statement, And then receiving and evaluating the initial output that ChatGPT produced in response to that initial prompt. So again, they were provided with a grading rubric that set pretty high standards for what I was looking for in this op-ed. And they were tasked with critically and systematically evaluating the AI output based on that rubric. The next stage was what I call the iterative revisions process, where they could continue to revise and reassess the output and the draft as they saw fit. And to be very clear at this point, I told them at this point you can choose to use AI however you want. If after that initial output you decide this is no good, I'm just going to write it myself. I feel like I could write a better op-ed on my own. By all means, go for it. On the other hand, if you feel this is great, it doesn't need any further edits, great, you can submit that, but you have to be able to justify it, and you have to remember that you are on the hook at the end of the day. And then finally, a critical reflection piece where they kind of walked through and reflected on how the tool shaped the process and the product of the op-ed writing, and kind of being very specific in terms of the strengths, the frustrations, the insights, and the experiences of working with these tools. What I was looking for in the final op-ed were these kind of key criteria of originality and insight, the depth and strength of the argument, the language and style, remembering again that op-eds are particularly notable for their personable, kind of engaging style, the engagement and persuasiveness of the argument, and the integration of evidence and sources. And again, emphasizing to the students that at the end of the day, you're on the hook. It's not enough to simply say, well, ChatGPT didn't integrate sources. You have to be in the ownership position there. So if ever there was a concern that AI was going to level out the quality of assignments across the board, fear not. This was a kind of quick snapshot of the grades that the final op-eds received, and you can see a pretty typical bell curve where most of the op-eds were rated a kind of competent B to A minus range, which is fairly typical. There were very few that were either outstanding or entirely insufficient. And it may not be a surprise to hear that there were certain elements of those evaluation criteria that tended to tilt stronger or weaker. Originality and insight tended to be very, very low. Language and style, in terms of the particularly personable style of an op-ed, also tended to be low. Whereas things like the structure of the argument, the overall flow of the piece, those tended to be higher than perhaps the typical student-only assignment. So, what did students think of this assignment? What did they take away from it? A couple of student reflections that I would like to highlight, evaluating in particular the AI strengths and weaknesses. First is that students very readily and quickly identified the benefits of AI when it comes to things like structure and organization, brainstorming. So students noting, for instance, that AI provided me with a solid foundation to work from, allowing me to focus on editing and improving specific sections rather than starting from scratch. Other students similarly echoing these ideas of organization and structure being a real strong point, something that they struggled with where the technology came in and was a real boost. On the other hand, students also very readily identified a lack of depth and personalization. As this student noted, there was an obvious lack of creativity in the responses. They were repetitive, they were formulaic. Another student said it felt empty in a way. AI responses convey an obvious lack of depth and humanity. And similarly, students identified the failures and limitations of at least the current versions of ChatGPT when it comes to integrating evidence and citations. This student said, I cannot exaggerate how loud I laughed when I saw the citation regarding inaccuracies when using AI was a made-up quote from the source that I provided. So inventing citations, inventing quotes. Recognizing, for instance, that many of the arguments that AI brought had a surface-level argument to them, and that many of those were inaccurate. So here again, students starting to break down into a bit more specificity and precision the strengths and limitations rather than a zero-sum kind of assessment of AI. Student reflections related to taking ownership and finding a balance were also especially notable. As this student said, AI can spit out whatever instructions I give it, but if I don't know how to instruct it, it becomes a useless tool. While it's nice to auto-generate, I realized the quality was far below what I would consider satisfactory. I would much rather develop my argument by hand, by myself, and know for certain every piece of information and every insight makes sense. I feel as though I produced a good passing argument with the use of ChatGPT today, but I don't think it's comparable to what I would have produced given this assignment sans mandatory AI usage. So I was really pleased and interested to see these kind of reflections because what you start to see is this recognition that the single factor that defines the quality differentiation of the final output is the student's own mastery and perspective of the material, right? That if the student doesn't offer the kind of detailed specificity and precision in their own argument provided in the prompt to ChatGPT, then that won't be reflected in the final product. So again, students starting to recognize that they are in control, that they are using this as a tool and as an assistant rather than as a kind of copy, paste, and deliver. We also saw more critical questions and nuanced perspectives emerging around the use of AI generally and in higher education specifically. So, students said, for instance, using the AI to write papers is not a strong recommendation I would make, but I can give a better answer other than just don't use it. The convenience of AI could influence people to be less creative and critical in thinking. It makes me reconsider some of my positions on AI being used alongside more traditional learning practices, although I still feel as though it's fundamentally cutting corners. So again, here we are emerging and moving towards a more nuanced perspective. At the start of this class, I had conversations with students who were often all in or all out on AI. What we see with these kind of comments is a much more nuanced, kind of precise critique and evaluation of where, how, and for what kind of purposes AI can be useful or potentially damaging and create either opportunities or obstacles. Insights for students and educators that these assignments offered. I would tell students that AI-generated responses do not compare to their unique writing capabilities, depth, and humanity. I would tell students to use ChatGPT as a tool rather than a crutch. AI can make students better and more independent thinkers and writers over time. I would recommend that students use AI to help and assist them, but not to rely on it completely. I would tell educators not to demonize ChatGPT, but to encourage its use in an ethical, responsible way. Now, for my part, what were my teaching takeaways having done this kind of experimental assignment for the first time in this class? The first thing were a few additions and modifications that I would recommend going forward. Um, First would be, I think there would be a real opportunity for benefit in peer evaluation and workshopping during that kind of editing and iterative process. I did give students the opportunity to revise their final op-ed after receiving my feedback as well. An extended debrief and discussion is always useful with assignments like these so that students have the opportunity to not only share their insights with me, but with each other as well. And larger, bigger picture insights in terms of the pedagogy and educational experience. I think one of the things that I found most gratifying about this assignment was a kind of affirmation of process-based learning, that students learn and experience a great deal that will carry them through future challenges and opportunities when they get the opportunity to really dig into the process. When it's not just about create an op-ed and send it to me, but show your work along the way. Consider the strengths and weaknesses, the opportunities and challenges that are presented by various tools in that process. A lot more is gained in that process focus, which is what ChatGPT is not so good at, right? AI is excellent at the output part. The students are really good at the process part. Student accountability was also a key value and insight here. to tell them that, yes, at the end of the day, no matter what kind of tools, no matter what kind of technology comes up in the future, at the end of the day, it's your work that is being evaluated, and it's your experience and process of the educational experience, of this assignment, of this course, that is going to be the real takeaway. And finally, a recognition that these are new technologies, that this is the first time I've done this assignment, that we are experimenting together, and that there's a value in going through and muddling through the pros and cons, the challenges, all of these things as a kind of collaborative experimentation process. So, all in all, I think I'd like to finish with a final quote from a student who I think sums up my feelings on this in many ways. This is the perfect time to test and see what the best way to implement AI could be. That way, when it becomes a much larger discussion or is implemented into everyday life, people won't be blindsided. People would be more prepared if we work with it first. And most importantly, people in college and university are the people who will lead the next generation, so it is important that they are capable of dealing with these issues. So I was very pleased with the spirit of experimentation and discovery in this assignment. I hope you will find it interesting as well. Please do feel free to reach out if you have any questions, ideas, iterations on this assignment as you experiment yourself.